when I set out to make the film, I knew right away at the beginning I didn't want the film to offer answers because I don't think there are answers.
Hi, Jason. How are you?
I'm great. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for the interest.
Absolutely. I feel the need to say it this way. We are in the middle of the Halloween season, and nothing I've seen has terrified me more than Monkey on a Stick. This
Perfect timing.
documentary about the Hare Krishnas has completely terrified me. And so,
Well, thank you.
oh, that's good.
Certainly one of the goals of the film is to sort of try to shock and frighten people. My background is as a dramatic genre filmmaker, and so I really drew on my experience having made crime and horror and films like that to try to shock the audience. But I hope that the result is that people are not afraid of the Hare Krishnas per se, but rather afraid of the sort of abuses that happened in ISKCON in the 70s and 80s and that sort of keep happening in other sort of any other sort of human sort of power structure where people are given way too much power. It's definitely not the goal of the film to make people afraid of Hare Krishnas, that's for sure.
No, absolutely, absolutely, and I want to talk about that because that's a very interesting line to walk with this film. But I would really like to know too why did you want to tell this story? Where did this come from?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I was given the book by a friend a long time ago, like in the year 2000, I think. I read the book and immediately thought, I just thought it was an unbelievable story. I couldn't believe I had never heard it before. And my impulse, even back then, was to adapt it dramatically, not as a documentary. But at that point, I hadn't even made a feature, so I just sort of, put it aside, kept it on my bookshelf. And then years later in 2016, I had made a couple of features. I had worked in television. So I optioned the book with the intent of making it as a TV series, a dramatic TV series, because what had happened between reading the book and optioning it was the golden age of television had happened. And so I could very easily see the book as like a Mad Men or a Sopranos style dramatic TV series. It's sort of a sort of an obvious idea. So I was working with Sphere, which is a big Canadian TV production company, and the producer of their dramatic division is Jennifer Kawaja, who had made these great Canadian TV shows like Sort of and Cardinal and The Porter. And we tried for several years to get it made and were unsuccessful. And Sphere, that's when the idea occurred to us was what maybe if we make a documentary out of this true story, that might grease the wheels, so to speak,
Mm.
of getting a dramatic TV series off the ground. So Sphere also has a documentary department, and that's headed by Marlo Miazga, who's the other producer on Monkey on a Stick. And so we put together the documentary version of the film, and that was hopefully phase one of our attempting to sort of and so you can really see me in the documentary leaning into my sort of dramatic tendencies as a filmmaker, really bringing more to the table than maybe your average documentary would in terms of the dramatic recreations, and even to the point where at the end of the film, doing something that maybe a lot of documentary filmmakers might be uncomfortable with it, which is really crossing the line into something that is kind of not documentary at all. It's kind of like a speculative sort of fiction of this thing that is magical realism almost, an impossible moment. And I'm sort of waiting for the blowback from the documentary community of like, you can't do that. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see the reaction to that.
It is an interesting transition, if you will, because there are moments in this film that are traditional documentary style, and there are some that are absolutely dramatic recreations, but not just one moment, but it feels like they're more expansive. But they still feel true to the story you want to tell. I actually think it works quite well. Um,
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, the book does that as well. And again, I can't claim any originality for that. This is something John and Lindsay did in Monkey on a Stick in the book. And the book actually was criticized very heavily when it came out, mostly by people in ISKCON, as being quote unquote fake or false because in the book, they had these sort of fictionalized, scenes where they would, write in using this prosaic device of drama, but of course, all the drama was backed up by footnotes where they were like, we heard this story from these 9 people, and then there's this newspaper article. And in my opinion, I thought it was a more truthful way of conveying what had happened because you could really feel the impact of how outrageous it was that a guru would drop acid and then chant Hare Krishna, and then have sex with his devotees. And so for me, I don't think documentary has this like more access to the truth than drama. Anyone who's ever made a documentary film knows how fake it all is and how manipulated it all is. What you choose to include versus what you don't choose to include. Asking interview subjects to repeat themselves. It's as having worked in doc and drama, documentary is as manufactured as drama is. And so when it comes to quote unquote telling the truth, I don't think you can do it either way. You could just try to come close. And so for me, it felt quite organic to just combine the two forms.
I think that's really interesting because again, this film really opens up the door for some big conversations, and I think still has that powerful truth component. And with that being said, I want to talk to you about this because I mean, here this we see something that begins as a spiritual movement but turns extremely violent. How does something make that transition? How does that's two opposite ends of the spectrum.
It is, but sadly, it's something we just see over and over and over again in human history. I mean, this the spiritual the commitment necessary for faith. Faith asks for total commitment, and for me, one of the most important reasons to include someone like Alma, our interview subject Alma, was I can feel her utter sincerity in her devotion and her faith. And she is a Krishna devotee to this day. And the depth of her commitment and her interest in having a relationship with God was so much more sincere than anything I saw in any of the gurus who were leading the movement. But to go back to your original question, in order to be that committed to something, you have to be all the way in. And that is just so ripe for exploitation and abuse. And I think, if you're asking the question of how does faith lead to violence, I go back to something like the Crusades, like, and it's something that we see over and over again. And that's why the film is most interested in just asking questions of people, whether it's about religion or government or bureaucracy in general. It's like, if you're going to be this committed to something, we need to think critically about these things. You cannot have uncritical devotion to something, whether it's the Catholic Church or patriotism or your country. And so it was very, very important to me that one of the final scenes in the film be these 3 people who had been in the movement, all sitting around in front of the Golden Gate Bridge, just talking critically about the founder of the movement and saying, like, you need to ask these questions in order to not have these kinds of abuses happen again. So I think that's the question you're asking is the same question the film is asking. How does something like this happen?
Yep. And one of the comments, like hearing what you're saying there, one of the comments I thought was fascinating in the film is that I think the scariest human trait is charisma.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk about that because we talk about that being a good thing, but I
I
think
know.
obviously these are stories where we hear and it's incredibly toxic.
Yeah, I mean, John Hubner is such a wise person, and when he said that, I was like, "Well, that's going in the film." And he's right, and I think when I think about it, I mean, my answer to that question, and again, these are the conversations I want people to have after they watch the movie, hopefully. But my answer to the question is, charisma is something that is irrational. It's not rational. It's not something you can lock down and like fixate on and like make math about. It's something that is just speaks to, when you experience the charisma of an artist or a politician, it just speaks to something irrational in you, and that's faith as well, right?
Yeah.
Faith, the point of faith is that it is irrational. It has to be irrational or it's not faith. Its unprovableness is what is its value. And so the charisma, that's the power of charisma. And it's just this eternal dynamic in human beings between rational and irrational. And these things that happen around us in the world, and we think, how can this be happening? Why are so many people following him or her? And it's because people need something irrational in their lives. But when it's treated uncritically, it is so ripe for abuse, and that's really what the film is about. And that's why it was important, I think, to include that idea of charisma in the film.
I'm glad you did. And one of the things I think that's interesting, going back to what you're saying, this is not an anti-faith film
No,
by any stretch at all.
no.
This is absolutely, I mean, it's anti-abuse, it's toxicity, but you have people being asked tough questions like, well, how do you meet with God? And they're giving their honest answers, and they're not like these are genuine devout people that are trying to share. So these are very big questions in this doc. So I guess the question I would ask is, so how do we balance that? Like there's this tension between faith and the history of abuse within this organization.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the film, when I set out to make the film, I knew right away at the beginning I didn't want the film to offer answers because I don't think there are answers. Like, if we haven't figured this out in 5,000 years, my movie is not going to figure it out. You know what I mean? One documentary is not going to figure it out. So all I wanted to do, and those talking head parts of the film are so important to me because I want to offer a spectrum of human responses to these big questions that I think people ask themselves every day since childhood. I was raised Anglican. I was an altar boy in the Anglican church. As a teenager, I became an atheist, but the older I get, I drift much more back into agnosticism. I don't have answers. I'm trying to be comfortable with not knowing, but I don't think very many people are comfortable with that. And so to show people wrestling with these answers and show people who are absolutely certain that they know, and Alma's answers are part of my favorite, amongst my favorite of the answers because she's certain that she knows. And then there are other people who are like, I don't know, and I think that's a very honest answer as well. And so yeah, like your question is like, how do we reconcile faith and abuse? I guess the closest the film comes to answering the question is critical thinking, and just be eternal vigilance. One of the jokes I make about the what happened in ISKCON is that ISKCON did a speed run of what the Catholic Church did in 1,000 years. They did it in 20 years, and I think the Catholic Church offers a perfect example of the kinds of, when I went to the Vatican as a young person. I couldn't, I was so stunned by the fact that I was walking through a palace made out of gold, and I was like, this is such a decadent, exorbitant, like when you think about Jesus and then you think about the Vatican, those two things didn't add up to me. And for me, it's like someone like Alma versus like a guru who's doing rails of cocaine while having sex with his devotees. It was the same kind of, how do we get from A to B, and how do we stop that from happening or try to stop that from happening?
I think it also comes up with somebody else says in the film that with God all things are possible, including murder. And I thought that is fascinating because having grown up in the church, I've heard that, not the murder part, but like with God all things are possible. Oh, that's great. But what we see in a film like this is people can use that
Yeah.
as a justification for brutality.
That's right. I think one of the most important lines in the film is when John invokes the Old Testament, where he says, the problems that happened in ISKCON were the things that the Old Testament tried to warn people about, which is like we need some limits here. Like that, and again, I'm not offering the Old Testament as a solution of any kind, but the idea of the Ten Commandments, is like an interesting recognition of the vulnerabilities of human sort of nature, right? And it's like maybe we should put down some rules. So again, I don't think this is something people have answers for, and again, the film is really just trying to start some conversations around that stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely, and you know it, and that's funny that you say that because we think about rules uh, being brought down because we're not thinking about the humanity of these and great leaders, right? We're thinking of the well, they're in this role, so they must be okay.
Right.
But in fact, they're just as human as everybody else, trying to figure it out. Honestly, Jason, the film is terrifying in a good way. I should clarify.
Thank you.
But what do you hope people take away from Monkey on a Stick?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, all my favorite films are films that I came out of and just immediately wanted to like go have a coffee with the people I went to the movie with and have a conversation about and something like Do the Right Thing was like a big movie for me and that's a film that just like almost in a painful way refuses to give you like an answer to what happened, and it demands that make up your own mind. And so I don't know if our film got to that level, but certainly it's something that invites people to, very much like the questions that are asked throughout the film and that the talking heads respond to. Yeah, I want people to go out and say, well, what would I say if somebody asked me, what do you want to be reincarnated as? If that was a thing, what would you like to be reincarnated as? Or what happens after you die? And so I really, if one person, two people go out and have a conversation after the film about some of the questions the film asks, I'll consider that sort of a success.
I really appreciate that. Honestly, Jason, it really is a great film, and I appreciate the chance to chat with you about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. And yeah, let's get the word out. Starting Friday at Cineplex, October 18th.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
It's like I said, it'll open some eyes.
Hope
Uh,
so.
hey, have a great day.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
you as well. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.